Grace Kelly was worshipped as an untouchable saint, but Mal Milan exposed the 24-year-old icon as a disposable homewrecker. Without raising her voice, the elite wife weaponized the studio cartel to execute a bloodless corporate assassination against her younger rival. Mal forced billionaires to brutally sever the affair, chaining the shattered golden girl to a multi-million-dollar lie. In 1954, the Hollywood studio system operated like a ruthless cartel. Image was literal currency, and Grace Kelly was Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's most valuable asset, marketed as the ultimate untouchable virgin. But underneath the tailored silk dresses, the 24-year-old was highly vulnerable, desperate for paternal validation. Ray Milland, a 47-year-old aging actor terrified of his fading virility, smelled that exact weakness on the set of Dial M for Murder. He offered her paternal attention disguised as romantic devotion, molding the naive superstar into a compliant mistress. Grace genuinely believed Milan would divorce his wife of 2 decades. She was completely unaware of the invisible surveillance network operating around them. The illusion of a private romance in Hollywood is a fatal miscalculation. Sound stages are echo chambers. Lighting technicians, makeup artists, and wardrobe assistants form a highly efficient, invisible surveillance network. Secrets do not exist. They are merely commodities traded for favor or cash. Ray Milland and Grace Kelly believed their clandestine meetings were hidden behind closed doors. They were entirely transparent to the ruling class. Mal Milland did not discover her husband was sleeping with his co-star by finding a misplaced love letter or smelling unfamiliar perfume on a lapel. She was informed through the quiet, ironclad whisper network of elite wives. She received the intelligence with the cold detachment of a general reviewing troop movements. She did not confront him immediately. She did not throw glass against the wall. Emotional outbursts are a surrender of power. Mal was a woman who possessed absolute control over her environment. She had spent over 2 decades securing her position within the highest social strata of Los Angeles. She understood that a Hollywood marriage was not built on romance. It was a corporate merger. She was the senior partner who managed the assets, curated the social connections, and maintained the public facade of stability that allowed her husband to secure lucrative contracts. She viewed Grace Kelly not as a romantic rival, but as a hostile corporate takeover attempting to seize her territory. Mal analyzed the situation with clinical precision. She looked at the 24-year-old actress. She saw the flawless skin, the blonde hair, and the carefully manufactured aura of virginity. She also saw the exact expiration date of those assets. Grace Kelly was a depreciating commodity operating in a market that demanded constant youth. Mal possessed assets that appreciated over time. She had leverage, capital, and an extensive network of loyal, influential allies. She realized that attacking Grace physically or verbally would lower her to the level of a common street brawl. It would grant the younger woman a false sense of importance. Mal chose a different battlefield. She chose total financial and social annihilation. The first weapon she deployed was the press. In the golden age of the studio system, the media was not independent. It was a heavily militarized extension of the studios themselves, controlled by a handful of terrifying gossip columnists. Hedda Hopper was the undisputed queen of this syndicate. She did not merely report the news, she dictated morality. A positive mention in her column could launch a career. A blind item implying moral turpitude could destroy a life. Hedda built her empire on fear, and she detested the studio's attempts to manufacture flawless saints. She lived to expose the rot beneath the glamour. Mal Millen and Hedda Hopper were close associates. They navigated the same exclusive country clubs and charity galas. Mal did not beg Hedda for a favor. She offered her a highly explosive piece of ammunition. She contacted the columnist and laid out the facts. Ray Millen, a married Academy Award winner, was engaging in a sordid affair with Grace Kelly, the untouchable ice princess of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The narrative was devastating. It was the perfect scandal. It possessed all the necessary elements to ignite massive public outrage. It featured a hypocritical older man and a young homewrecker masquerading as a Catholic saint. Mal provided Hedda with the exact coordinates to strike the studio cartel where it hurt the most. The threat was explicit and immediate. If Hedda Hopper published the story, the Catholic Legion of Decency would immediately condemn Grace Kelly. The Legion possessed the power to organize massive boycotts across the country. The boycotts would instantly tank the box office returns for her upcoming films. Millions of dollars in studio investments would evaporate overnight. The carefully constructed multi-million-dollar marketing campaign built on Kelly's purity would become a toxic liability. Mal effectively placed a loaded gun to the head of the most powerful executives in the world. She made her husband's infidelity their financial problem to solve. Simultaneously, Mal activated the second phase of her execution. She summoned her legal team. She did not instruct them to draft a separation agreement. She ordered them to prepare a divorce settlement that would execute a total financial extraction. California community property laws dictated an equal division of assets, but Mal sought punitive damages through leverage. She documented every property, every bank account, and every single investment generated during their 20-year marriage. Ray Milland was accustomed to a lifestyle of profound luxury. He relied on the wealth Mal meticulously managed. She instructed her lawyers to freeze his access. She prepared documents that would strip him of his primary residence, his liquid capital, and his social standing. She designed a trap that left him with absolutely no viable exit. If he chose the 24-year-old actress, he would walk away completely broke. He would face a highly publicized divorce trial that would brand him a predator. He would lose the respect of his peers and the backing of the studios, who despised actors that cost them money. He would be reduced to a disgraced aging man reliant on the fleeting affections of a young woman who would inevitably leave him when his power faded. Mal knew her husband. She knew his profound cowardice. She knew he loved his wealth and his comfort far more than he loved the thrill of a forbidden romance. Mal Milland did not need to confront Grace Kelly. Confrontation implies a negotiation between equals. Mal considered the actress entirely irrelevant to the outcome. Grace was merely a symptom of her husband's midlife vanity. The true battle was between Mal and the studio executives. She sat in her immaculate living room reviewing the legal documents, holding the entire machinery of Hollywood hostage. She did not shed a single tear. She did not seek sympathy from her friends. She operated in absolute silence, tightening the noose. While Mal constructed this elaborate guillotine, Grace Kelly remained completely oblivious. She continued to arrive on the set of Dial M for Murder, projecting the image of a radiant woman in love. She sat in her dressing room waiting for Ray Milland to visit between takes. She fantasized about their future together. She envisioned a life where she was the respected wife of a distinguished British actor, finally securing the paternal approval she desperately craved. She was entirely blinded by the script she had written in her head. She failed to perceive the massive structural forces shifting beneath her feet. She did not understand that she was standing on a highly volatile fault line ready to swallow her whole. The studio executives received the intelligence regarding Mal Milland's ultimatum. Panic swept through the executive boardrooms of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and Paramount Pictures. They recognized the lethal severity of the threat. Hedda Hopper was not bluffing. Mal Milland was not bluffing. The executives looked at their financial projections. They looked at the millions of dollars tied directly to the pristine reputation of Grace Kelly. They calculated the catastrophic losses a public adultery scandal would inflict. The math was brutal and undeniable. The affair had to be terminated immediately. The men who ran the studios were not artists. They were ruthless businessmen. They did not care about the romantic entanglements of their employees unless those entanglements threatened the bottom line. Ray Milland had become a massive liability. Grace Kelly had become a toxic asset, requiring immediate containment. The executives did not send mediators. They deployed fixers. They initiated a coordinated, aggressive intervention designed to crush the romance and force the actors back into their highly profitable boxes. Mal Milland had successfully outsourced her revenge. She forced the most powerful men in the entertainment industry to do her dirty work. She did not have to scream at her husband to come home. The studio bosses were about to deliver him back to her doorstep entirely broken and completely subjugated. She had utilized her elite power to turn the massive corporate machinery of Hollywood into a weapon of personal retaliation. She sat back and waited for the execution to commence. Grace Kelly remained oblivious to the coalition of executives, publicists, and an elite wife currently engineering her downfall. The execution was carried out not in a dark alley, but in a heavily air-conditioned executive boardroom, lined with polished mahogany. The studio bosses did not operate with emotion. They operated like a board of directors neutralizing a hostile threat to their stock price. They summoned Ray Milland. They did not invite him for a friendly lunch to discuss his indiscretions. They ordered him to appear. When the veteran actor walked through the heavy oak doors, he was met with a wall of silence. The room was filled with studio heads, legal fixers, and public relations generals. They did not offer him a drink. They offered him an ultimatum. The executives laid the reality of the situation flat on the table. They bypassed morality and went straight to the mathematics of his ruin. They informed him that his wife, Mal Milland, had armed Hedda Hopper with the exact details of his affair with Grace Kelly. They told him the divorce papers were already drafted, weaponized to strip him of his California real estate, his bank accounts, and his liquid assets. Then they presented the studio's position. If Hedda Hopper published the story, the Catholic Legion of Decency would boycott Grace Kelly's films. Paramount and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer stood to lose millions in box office revenue. They looked at the 47-year-old actor and delivered the bottom line. If he cost the studio their investment, they would completely blacklist him. His contract would be shredded. He would never work on a major studio lot again. Ray Milland's sophisticated, authoritative persona evaporated in a matter of seconds. The illusion of the fearless romantic lead shattered under the crushing weight of financial ruin. He was a man accustomed to bespoke suits, expensive scotch, and the deference of film crews. The prospect of losing his wealth and his industry standing terrified him to his core. He did not attempt to defend his love for the 24-year-old actress. He did not negotiate for a graceful exit. Faced with the choice between a young mistress and his entire empire, he folded instantly. The survival instinct of a Hollywood actor is purely transactional. He agreed to every single condition the executives laid out. He agreed to sever all contact with Grace Kelly immediately. He agreed to return to his wife and submit to whatever terms she required. He sold out the woman who adored him without a single moment of hesitation. With the male liability secured and subjugated, the studio machinery turned its crosshairs on Grace Kelly. They did not treat her with the reverence usually reserved for their most valuable star. They treated her like a defective piece of equipment that required immediate recalibration. She was summoned to the executive offices. She walked in wearing an immaculate tailored dress, projecting the cool, untouchable aura of the Ice Princess. She expected to discuss a script revision or a wardrobe fitting. She walked directly into a firing squad. The executives did not yell. They spoke with the chilling, detached tone of corporate assassins. They informed her that the affair was over. They did not ask for her side of the story. They dictated the new reality. They told her that Ray Milland was returning to his wife. They informed her that Hedda Hopper was holding a loaded gun to her career, and the studio was stepping in to absorb the bullet. Grace sat in the leather chair, her pristine facade cracking. The words hit her like physical blows. She tried to process the information, but her mind rejected it. Her deeply ingrained psychological need for paternal validation convinced her that Ray would protect her. She believed the script she had written in her head, the narrative where the older, wiser man sacrificed his unhappy marriage to rescue her. The executives shattered that delusion with brutal efficiency. They stripped away the romance and exposed the ugly, transactional nature of the affair. They made it explicitly clear that Milland had thrown her to the wolves to save his own bank accounts. Then came the gag order. The studio did not just break her heart. They imprisoned her voice. They handed down a strict, uncompromising directive. She was forbidden from speaking to the press. She was forbidden from contacting Ray Milland. She was ordered to leave Los Angeles temporarily to allow the publicity fixers to scrub the rumors from the gossip columns. She was instructed to maintain her public image of the flawless Catholic virgin at all costs. She was not allowed to mourn. She was not allowed to show anger. She was ordered to swallow the humiliation and get back to work. If she disobeyed, the studio would leak the story themselves and destroy her intentionally. They owned her, and they were reminding her of the terms of her ownership. Grace left the executive building in a state of profound shock. The ground had disappeared beneath her feet. The betrayal was total, but the human capacity for denial is incredibly resilient. Despite the brutal briefing from the studio bosses, a desperate part of her still believed it was a misunderstanding. She believed that if she could just speak to Ray, he would explain everything. He would tell her that the studio forced his hand, but his heart belonged to her. She sought him out. She needed to hear the rejection from his own mouth. When she finally reached him, the reality was worse than anything the executives had described. Ray Milland was cold, distant, and entirely closed off. The charming, attentive mentor she had fallen in love with on the set was gone. In his place was a terrified, self-preserving coward. He did not offer her a romantic farewell. He did not apologize for the mess he had dragged her into. He looked at her with the panicked eyes of a man trying to escape a burning building. He slammed the door in her face. The rejection was absolute and devoid of any basic human empathy. He cut the cord efficiently and ruthlessly to save his own skin. That closed door was the exact moment the Ice Princess truly shattered. The humiliation was absolute. The pain did not stem simply from a broken romance. It stemmed from the total violent destruction of her ego. She was Grace Kelly, the most desired woman on the planet, worshipped by millions of fans, and pursued by the most powerful men in the world. Yet, in the cold light of reality, she had been reduced to a cheap, disposable mistress. She had been used to stroke the ego of an aging actor, and the moment she became a liability, she was discarded like trash. She realized the profound powerlessness of her position. Her A-list beauty, her Oscar nominations, and her global fame were completely useless against the structural power of Mal Milan and the studio cartel. Mal had not even bothered to enter the battlefield. The elite wife had simply made a few phone calls, leveraged her social capital, and watched from her mansion as the studio executives did the dirty work of exterminating the threat. Mal reclaimed her husband not because she loved him, but because she owned him. Grace was left alone in the wreckage. She had to pack her bags and flee Los Angeles exactly as she was ordered. She carried the heavy, suffocating weight of intense shame. She had violated her own strict moral code, disappointed the rigid expectations of her overbearing father, and allowed herself to be manipulated by a predator. She had to sit on airplanes and in hotel rooms, staring at her own flawless reflection in the mirror, knowing the dirty, pathetic truth behind the image. The studio publicists went to work. They engaged in a massive, expensive cover-up operation. They planted fake stories in the press about Grace dating suitable single actors. They heavily promoted her pristine, untouchable image. They successfully bleached the scandal from the mainstream media landscape. The public continued to buy tickets, blissfully unaware of the brutal psychological slaughter that had just occurred behind the gates of Paramount Pictures. Grace Kelly was forced to participate in her own cover-up. She had to walk onto red carpets and smile for the flashbulbs. She had to answer questions from journalists about her innocent fairy tale life. Every smile was a lie. Every graceful wave was an act of extreme discipline. She was bleeding internally, forced to perform the role of the saint while carrying the branding of a homewrecker. The studio had saved her career, but they had effectively taken her soul as collateral. She was a highly paid, beautifully dressed prisoner of a system that demanded absolute obedience in exchange for fame. The exile of Grace Kelly was not a punishment carried out in a dark subterranean dungeon. It was a highly sanitized, brutally luxurious imprisonment executed in the penthouse suites of the East Coast. When the studio cartel ordered her to vanish from Los Angeles to let the radioactive fallout of her affair dissipate, they did not leave her unattended. She was escorted by a highly paid phalanx of studio publicists, handlers, and wardrobe assistants. They were not her friends. They were her wardens. Their sole directive was to ensure the 24-year-old actress did not suffer a public nervous breakdown that would jeopardize her multi-million-dollar box office value. Grace was confined to immaculate, high-ceilinged hotel rooms, surrounded by room service silver platters and suffocating bouquets of flowers sent by nervous studio executives. It was a gilded cage designed to muffle the screams of a completely shattered ego. Inside that quiet luxury, the true psychological torture commenced. Grace was suffering from a violent emotional detox. The withdrawal was not from a chemical substance, but from a potent, intoxicating delusion. For months, she had been feeding on the manufactured affection of a 47-year-old predator. She had built an entire psychological architecture around the belief that Ray Milland was her protector, her soulmate, and her definitive escape from the crushing expectations of her domineering father. The sudden, violent removal of that illusion left a gaping, bleeding crater in her psyche. She replayed the memory of the slammed door endlessly. She dissected his cold, panicked eyes. The realization that she was never a queen, but merely a disposable pawn in an aging man's desperate bid for virility, burned through her veins like acid. Behind closed doors, she struggled deeply. The sudden and public humiliation of the affair took a heavy psychological toll. But the Hollywood machine does not allow its assets the luxury of organic grief. A broken heart is a personal problem. A broken image is a corporate crisis. The studio could not afford for Grace to look depressed, haggard, or ruined. The Whisper Network in Los Angeles was still humming with the lethal intelligence Mal Milan had strategically leaked. If Grace disappeared from the public eye completely, the gossip columnists would smell the blood in the water. They would assume she was in hiding, effectively confirming the sordid rumors of the home wrecking scandal. Therefore, the studio executives initiated the next phase of their ruthless cover-up operation. They weaponized her trauma and forced her to perform. The public relations generals arrived at her hotel suite with a meticulously crafted battle plan. They did not ask about her mental state. They handed her a schedule. The strategy was simple and deeply cynical: to eradicate the image of Grace Kelly as a desperate mistress to an older married man. They had to flood the media market with images of Grace Kelly as the highly coveted innocent prize of eligible, aristocratic bachelors. They initiated a relentless campaign of orchestrated showmances. The handlers selected her wardrobe, dictating every hemline and string of pearls to project maximum untouchable purity. They painted her face, applying the cosmetics like plaster over a cracked foundation. Then they pushed her out the door and into the flashing bulbs of the paparazzi at the Stork Club, El Morocco, and exclusive Broadway premieres. She was paraded on the arms of famous designers, wealthy playboys, and highly approved leading men. The studio essentially used her as a heavily decorated decoy, distracting the global audience from the dirty reality of the Paramount lot. This was a specific, excruciating brand of psychological violence. Every time Grace stepped out of a limousine, she was forced to execute a flawless performance of radiant, carefree youth. She had to laugh at jokes she did not hear. She had to gaze adoringly at men she did not care about. She had to project the aura of a woman who had the world at her feet, while internally she felt like a piece of discarded garbage. The camera flashes were blinding, capturing the pristine, symmetrical beauty of the A-list icon. But behind the perfectly painted red smile, she was biting the inside of her cheek to keep from screaming. She was a hostage, forced to read a ransom note written by her captors, pretending it was a love letter. The sheer cognitive dissonance was tearing her apart. The deeper the internal humiliation gnawed at her, the brighter the studio demanded she shine. The executives knew exactly what they were doing. They were utilizing her deepest, most paralyzing fear to ensure her absolute compliance, the terrifying specter of her father, John B. Kelly. The studio fixers did not need to chain her to a radiator. They simply needed to remind her of her family's strict, unforgiving Philadelphia Catholic standards. Her father was a man who demanded absolute perfection and viewed Hollywood as a den of vulgar iniquity. Grace had spent her entire existence desperately trying to prove her worth to a man incapable of offering unconditional love. The studio quietly leveraged this profound psychological wound. They implicitly communicated that if she did not follow the PR script, if she rebelled or spoke out, they would remove the protective barrier they had built around her. They would let Hedda Hopper off the leash. The sordid, filthy details of her affair with a man nearly twice her age would be splashed across the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Her father would read about his aristocratic daughter acting as a cheap, compliant mistress. The mere thought of that ultimate, devastating rejection paralyzed her. It was the masterstroke of the cartel's control mechanism. They used her daddy issues as an invisible choking collar. She submitted entirely. She swallowed the humiliation. She allowed the publicists to pose her, dress her, and dictate her every public utterance. She surrendered her autonomy completely, accepting her role as a highly paid, beautifully maintained puppet, terrified that cutting the strings would result in total familial annihilation. While Grace was suffocating under the weight of her forced, smiling exile, a completely different dynamic was settling into the opulent mansions of Los Angeles. Mal Milland had won the war without firing a single physical shot. She had successfully utilized the 21-year age gap between herself and her rival, not as a point of insecurity, but as a massive tactical advantage. She had proven that the fleeting physical allure of a 24-year-old actress was completely useless against the entrenched structural power of a veteran Hollywood wife. When Ray Milland returned to his marital home, there was no tearful reunion. There was no grand romantic reconciliation. Mal did not demand a groveling apology, nor did she offer forgiveness. Forgiveness is a concept reserved for equals. Mal viewed her husband as an asset that had temporarily malfunctioned and required a severe, permanent recalibration. The Milland household transformed into a quiet, chilling panopticon of domestic subjugation. Ray had chosen to protect his wealth and his career over his illicit romance, and Mal made sure he understood the exact price of that choice every single day. She did not lock him in a room. She locked him in his own cowardice. He was allowed to sleep in the massive bed, drink the expensive scotch, and attend the exclusive country club dinners. But he was entirely stripped of his masculine authority. He knew with absolute certainty that his wife held the detonator to his entire existence. The divorce papers she had ordered drafted were not destroyed. They were merely filed away, a silent, loaded gun resting permanently on the mahogany desk of their shared life. Ray Milland, the sophisticated Oscar-winning leading man, returned home to a permanently altered marriage. He had surrendered much of his personal and financial authority. He now sat across the table from a woman who had firmly reestablished her control. The marriage was no longer a partnership. It was a maximum security prison with velvet drapes. Mal had reasserted her territorial dominance with terrifying precision. She retained the husband, she protected the fortune, and she maintained her elite social standing, proving to the entire Hollywood power structure that she was an apex predator who could not be crossed. Eventually, the studio cartel deemed the media landscape sufficiently sterilized. The fake dates had generated enough distracting headlines, and Hedda Hopper had been placated by whatever backroom deals the executives had brokered. The crisis was officially classified as contained. It was time for the machinery to resume production. Grace Kelly was summoned back to Los Angeles. The return to the West Coast was a walk to the executioner's block. Grace had to step back onto the studio lots, walking past the very executives who had coldly dismantled her life and ordered her to shut her mouth. She had to navigate the makeup trailers and sound stages where the Whisper Network was still highly active. Everyone knew The directors, the lighting technicians, the wardrobe assistants, they all knew she had been dumped, humiliated, and forced into submission. Yet the brutal etiquette of the Hollywood hierarchy demanded that no one speak of it. She was surrounded by a conspiracy of silence. She had to sit in the makeup chair, staring into the brightly lit mirror, while artists painted over the dark circles of her insomnia. She had to endure the agonizing cognitive dissonance of feeling entirely broken while being actively transformed into the most desirable, flawless object on the planet. The Ice Princess persona was no longer just a marketing strategy. It became her armor, her prison, and her survival mechanism. She stepped in front of the massive 35mm cameras. The director yelled, "Action!" The heavy, blinding studio lights hit her face. In that moment, she was required to summon every ounce of discipline she possessed. She had to bury the visceral memory of the slammed door. She had to silence the phantom voice of her judgmental father. She had to suppress the suffocating realization that the studio owned her soul. She delivered her lines with perfect aristocratic diction. She projected the cool, untouchable elegance that generated millions of dollars for the men who had just destroyed her autonomy. This was the true invisible violence of the Golden Age. The physical labor of acting was nothing compared to the psychological labor of maintaining the facade. Grace Kelly was performing a dual role, the character in the script and the character of Grace Kelly, the untainted star. The sheer effort required to sustain that heavy, suffocating mask was slowly eroding her internal foundation. She maintained a flawless public exterior while dealing with profound personal turmoil. The studio had protected their investment, but the emotional cost to their star was immense. The climax of this agonizing performance was rapidly approaching, setting the stage for a night of glittering triumph that would serve as the ultimate crushing blow to her shattered pride. The return to the Los Angeles studio lots was merely the prerequisite for a far more grueling corporate marathon. The studio cartel had successfully extinguished the immediate threat of Hedda Hopper's expose, but damage control is only the defensive phase of Hollywood warfare. The offensive phase requires total, unassailable validation. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and Paramount Pictures needed a mechanism to permanently seal Grace Kelly's reputation in an impenetrable vault of prestige. They needed an Academy Award. The campaign for the Oscars was not an artistic endeavor. It was a highly capitalized, ruthlessly executed military operation. The executives looked at their 24-year-old asset and understood the specific mechanics of public absolution. The American public will forgive almost anything if it is wrapped in the heavy golden armor of industry validation. An Oscar win would definitively overwrite the whispered label of homewrecker with the permanent, highly marketable title of serious artist. The studio machinery geared up to secure that statue at all costs, and Grace was drafted as the primary foot soldier in a war for her own bleached legacy. The vehicle chosen for this coronation was a film called The Country Girl. The selection itself was a masterstroke of cynical public relations. The executives deliberately stripped Grace of her signature glamorous, untouchable Ice Princess aesthetic. They stripped away the tailored silk, the diamonds, and the perfectly coiffed hair. They placed her in drab, shapeless cardigans, applied makeup to make her look exhausted, and cast her as the bitter, long-suffering wife of an aging alcoholic actor. The profound, sickening irony of the casting was not lost on Grace. She was forced to memorize lines and perform the role of a woman dealing with a broken older man, while her own reality was defined by her subjugation to the 47-year-old Ray Milland. She was acting out a sanitized, fictionalized version of her own trauma. The studio was effectively monetizing her psychological wreckage. They used the dark circles under her eyes, born from genuine insomnia and the agonizing stress of the gag order, and marketed it as method acting. Every time the director yelled action, she had to tap into the very real visceral humiliation of the slammed door and project it onto the celluloid. She was cannibalizing her own devastation to generate profit for the men who had ordered her destruction. The Oscar campaign trail was a psychological gauntlet designed to test her absolute compliance. Grace was required to attend a relentless schedule of industry luncheons, private screenings, and elite cocktail parties. These were not celebrations of cinema, they were aggressive lobbying events. She had to walk into crowded, smoke-filled rooms, populated by the most powerful, ruthless individuals in the entertainment industry. This was where the true invisible terror resided. These rooms were not filled with oblivious fans. They were filled with the directors, producers, and financiers who knew the exact, dirty truth. The Whisper Network had distributed the intelligence of the Mal-Meland ultimatum to everyone who mattered. As Grace moved through the ballrooms, projecting her manufactured aura of pristine elegance, she could feel the eyes dissecting her. She knew that the men smiling at her and shaking her hand were the same men who had ruthlessly calculated her value against a potential boycott. Even worse were the elite wives. Mal-Meland did not need to be physically present in the room to exert her dominance. Her network was ubiquitous. The older, wealthy wives of the studio heads and powerful producers observed Grace with a cold, unified solidarity. They looked at the 24-year-old superstar not with awe, but with the smug, quiet satisfaction of predators who had successfully neutralized a threat. Grace had to smile at these women. She had to engage in polite, meaningless conversation, knowing they viewed her as a defeated, disciplined subordinate. The social hierarchy of Hollywood had been brutally enforced, and Grace was required to publicly acknowledge her place at the bottom of the elite food chain. The cognitive effort required to maintain this facade was staggering. She had to block out the paralyzing fear of her father's judgment. She had to suppress the residual, humiliating grief of her rejection. She had to operate like a highly advanced, flawlessly programmed machine. Every spontaneous emotion was a liability. Every genuine reaction was a potential breach of contract. She was a woman completely isolated in the center of a crowded room, surrounded by handlers who monitored her alcohol intake, vetted her conversation partners, and dictated her schedule down to the minute. She possessed the most famous face on the planet, but she lacked the basic human autonomy to choose who she spoke to or where she went. While Grace was dragged through this grueling, high-stakes campaign, the architect of her misery remained firmly entrenched in his domestic prison. Ray Milland was forced to watch the entire spectacle unfold from the confines of his living room. His career had not vanished entirely, but the trajectory had been severely, permanently altered. The studio executives remembered his profound cowardice. They knew he was a man who buckled under pressure, a man whose personal indiscretions required massive, expensive corporate intervention. He was no longer a reliable, bankable leading man. He was a managed liability. Mal-Meland controlled the atmosphere of the household with the same cold efficiency she had used to control the studio bosses. She did not forbid him from watching the Academy Award coverage. She allowed the television to broadcast the images of the woman he had discarded. It was a calculated, silent punishment. Ray sat in his armchair, a scotch in his hand, watching Grace Kelly's face dominate the newsreels and the industry trades. He had to witness her ascent to the absolute pinnacle of Hollywood prestige, knowing he had sacrificed his access to her to preserve the very room he was sitting in. He was trapped in the agonizing realization that his betrayal had not saved his dignity. It had only highlighted his weakness. Grace was being molded into a cinematic legend, while he was slowly calcifying into an aging, managed husband. Mal did not need to vocalize her victory. The undeniable reality of their respective positions was broadcast into their living room every single evening. The 21-year age gap between the two women had proven entirely irrelevant. Capital, leverage, and a cold heart had definitively won the war. The pressure on Grace reached a critical mass as the night of the Academy Awards approached. The studio executives escalated their demands. They did not suggest she win, they required it. The financial projections for the next 5 years of Paramount and MGM releases were heavily tethered to the outcome of the opening envelope. The public relations fixers worked overtime, ensuring that the narrative in the press focused exclusively on her dedication to the craft and her impeccable aristocratic background. The preparation for the ceremony was a masterclass in psychological masking. The wardrobe department did not select a dress. They constructed armor. Edith Head, the legendary costume designer, created a gown of ice blue silk. It was a garment designed to project maximum untouchable royalty. It was restrictive, heavy, and flawlessly tailored. It left no room for error, no room for humanity. When Grace looked in the mirror before leaving for the Pantages Theater, she did not see a 24-year-old woman. She saw the multi-million-dollar corporate asset the studio had manufactured. The Ice Princess mask was bolted firmly into place. The limousine ride to the theater was a journey into the heart of the machine. The streets of Hollywood were lined with thousands of screaming fans. Searchlights cut through the Los Angeles smog. The sheer scale of the event was terrifying. This was the ultimate judgment day of the cartel. When the car door opened, the sensory overload was absolute. The roar of the crowd was deafening. The flashbulbs of hundreds of cameras created a blinding, continuous strobe effect. Grace stepped onto the red carpet. The training kicked in. Her posture was rigidly perfect. Her smile was a precise, calculated curve of her lips. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a monarch, reviewing her troops. But the physical reality of the red carpet was entirely different from the projected image. It was a highly controlled, aggressive environment. The reporters shouted questions, thrusting microphones into her face. The studio publicists flanked her, physically guiding her through the gauntlet, squeezing her arm to dictate when to stop and when to move. She was a valuable piece of cargo being transported through a hostile zone. She walked into the lobby of the Pantages Theater. The air was thick with tension, expensive perfume, and the sharp scent of fear. The room was packed with the very people who had engineered her humiliation. She saw the studio executives in their tailored tuxedos, the men who had ordered her to shut her mouth and accept her rejection. She saw the elite wives, the silent enforcers of the social hierarchy, observing her from the corners of their eyes. Every step she took towards her designated seat was a step deeper into the belly of the beast. The auditorium was a velvet-lined trap. She was entirely surrounded by the power structure that had ruthlessly crushed her autonomy. She took her seat in the front row, bathed in the harsh, unforgiving light of the television cameras. The entire world was watching her, waiting for a reaction, waiting for a flaw. The ceremony began, The speeches dragged on. The tension in Grace's chest tightened to the point of physical pain. The category for Best Actress was approaching. The psychological trap was brilliantly, sadistically constructed. If she lost the award, the studio's massive investment in her absolution would fail. She would remain vulnerable, a highly paid asset with a tarnished reputation, susceptible to the whims of the executives who had already proven they would discard her if she became a liability. But if she won, the trap snapped shut permanently. Winning the Oscar meant she was entirely, irrevocably owned by the system. It meant she had successfully executed the corporate mandate. It meant she had successfully weaponized her own trauma and sold it back to the public. A victory would weld the Ice Princess mask to her face forever. She would never be allowed to be a vulnerable, flawed human being again. She would be forced to maintain the saintly facade for the rest of her natural life, or risk destroying the very legacy the award cemented. The presenter walked onto the stage. The auditorium fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The camera focused on Grace's face. She held her breath. Her hands were perfectly still in her lap, gripping the silk of her dress. Her mind was entirely blank, wiped clean by the sheer crushing pressure of the moment. The presenter opened the envelope. The studio bosses held their collective breath. Mal Millen watched from a television screen miles away. The name was about to be read, and the final, inescapable verdict of the Hollywood cartel was about to be delivered. The presenter tore the seal of the heavy paper envelope. The microscopic sound of tearing paper seemed to echo like a gunshot across the cavernous, silent auditorium of the Pantages Theater. In the front row, Grace Kelly did not blink. Her posture remained flawless, locked into the rigid, aristocratic bearing the studio cartel had drilled into her. The executives sitting several rows behind her leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the stage, their minds rapidly calculating the massive financial ramifications of the next few seconds. And the winner is Grace Kelly. The auditorium erupted. The applause was a physical wave of sound that crashed over the front rows. The flash bulbs fired in a blinding, continuous barrage. Grace stood up. She did not weep. She did not cover her face in shock. She executed the exact, precise reaction the public relations generals had mandated. She smiled a modest, perfectly calibrated smile. She nodded to her peers. She began the long walk toward the stage. This was the climax of the multi-million-dollar absolution campaign. As she ascended the steps, the heavy silk of her Edith headgown brushing against the carpet, she experienced a profound, terrifying psychological detachment. She was stepping out of her own body, watching a highly engineered corporate asset maneuver through a crowded room. She took the golden statue from the presenter. It was heavy. It was cold. It was the physical manifestation of her complete and total subjugation. She stepped to the microphone. She looked out at the sea of faces. In the blinding glare of the spotlights, she could see the studio bosses who had ordered her into exile. She saw the fixers who had drafted her gag order. She saw the elite wives who had observed her humiliation with cold, predatory satisfaction. The entire power structure of Hollywood was giving her a standing ovation. They were not applauding her talent. They were applauding her compliance. They were celebrating the successful total cover-up of a scandal that would have cost them millions. Grace gripped the edges of the podium. She delivered her acceptance speech. Her voice did not waver. Her diction was flawless. She thanked the director. She thanked the producers. She thanked the very studio system that had ruthlessly dismantled her private life and stripped her of her autonomy. With every word of gratitude, She spoke into the microphone. She was publicly signing her own terms of surrender. She was validating the brutal mechanics of the machine. She was acknowledging, before a global audience of millions, that she belonged entirely to the cartel. The psychological trap had snapped shut. The Academy Award functioned as much as a calculated public relations tool for the studio as it did an acting honor. By accepting the industry's highest award, her public image as the flawless star was permanently solidified. She could never step out of line again. The studio had invested too much capital into bleaching her reputation. If she ever rebelled, if she ever dared to expose the dirty transactional reality of the Hollywood hierarchy, the system would point to this exact moment. They would label her an ungrateful, unstable liar. The Oscar was a golden muzzle, ensuring her absolute silence for the rest of her career. Miles away in her heavily guarded Los Angeles estate, Mal Millen observed the broadcast not with jealousy, but with the cold satisfaction of a general watching a successful military campaign. Capital and leverage had definitively won the war. She had looked at a global cinematic icon, a woman 21 years her junior, and she had systematically annihilated her without ever leaving the house. She had utilized the brutal, unforgiving laws of capital and leverage to protect her territory. She had forced the most powerful executives in the world to do her dirty work. She had turned the massive corporate machinery of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and Paramount Pictures into her own personal security detail. Sitting across the room from Mal was Ray Milland. The veteran Oscar-winning actor watched the woman he had briefly believed was his soulmate accept the highest award in cinema. He watched her glowing, triumphant image broadcast to millions. But inside the Milland household, the reality of his existence was bleak and castrated. He was not a conqueror. He was a defeated, managed liability. Mal had allowed him to return to the marriage, but the power dynamic was permanently altered. He was fully aware that the divorce papers, the documents that would strip him of his fortune and his dignity, were still sitting in a lawyer's safe, ready to be deployed the moment he stepped out of line. He sat in his armchair, a silent hostage to his own cowardice. He had traded the thrill of a forbidden romance for the safety of his bank accounts, and in doing so, he had handed his wife absolute dictatorial control over his life. Mal Milland had retained her husband, protected her immense wealth, and maintained her elite social standing. She had proven that physical beauty and youth are entirely useless against a woman who controls the financial architecture of a marriage. Back at the Pantages Theater, Grace Kelly was escorted off the stage and shoved directly into the aggressive, chaotic machinery of the press room. The publicists flanked her immediately. The reporters shouted questions, demanding sound bites about her triumph, her dress, and her pristine, innocent life. She answered every question with the mechanical perfection of a trained operative. The flashbulbs popped relentlessly, capturing the image of the triumphant ice princess. The photographs would be wired across the globe by morning, cementing the studio's narrative into historical fact. The rest of the night was a grueling marathon of elite after-parties. Grace was paraded through the governor's ball and exclusive private dinners. She had to navigate crowded ballrooms filled with the very people who knew the truth. She had to accept congratulations from men who viewed her as a highly profitable commodity. She had to endure the knowing, condescending smiles of the older Hollywood wives. Every handshake, every raised glass of champagne was a reinforcement of her subjugation. She was the most celebrated woman in the room, and she had never been more entirely powerless. the sheer physical exhaustion of the performance began to set in, but the public relations handlers did not allow her to break character for a single second. Her jaw ached from the relentless manufactured smiling. Her back throbbed from the rigid posture demanded by the heavy silk gown. She was surrounded by hundreds of people, yet she was operating in a state of profound, terrifying isolation. There was no one she could trust. There was no one she could speak to honestly. She was a solitary prisoner in a very loud, very expensive cell. It was only hours later, in the dead of night, that the handlers finally retreated. Grace was escorted back to her hotel suite. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut, and for the first time in days she was completely alone. The silence in the room was absolute and deafening. She walked slowly into the master bathroom. She did not turn on the harsh overhead lights. She stood in the dim glow of the vanity mirror. She placed the Golden Academy Award on the marble counter. It made a heavy, dull thud. She looked at her own reflection. The makeup was still flawless. The hair was still perfectly styled. The Ice Princess was staring back at her. But beneath the cosmetics, the reality of her existence settled into her bones with the weight of a concrete block. She had won the ultimate prize. She had achieved the absolute pinnacle of cinematic success. She had successfully navigated the demands of the studio and secured her legacy. But the cost was total. She had lost her autonomy. She had been brutally discarded by a man who treated her as a disposable pawn. She had been outmaneuvered and humiliated by an elite wife who wielded power she could not even comprehend. She was a 24-year-old woman whose entire life trajectory was now permanently dictated by the board of directors of a corporate cartel. She looked at the golden statue resting on the marble. It was a beautiful, shining monument to her own silence. The system had broken her, repackaged the pieces, and sold it back to the world as a triumph. She knew, in the cold, quiet darkness of that hotel room, that she would never be free. The studio had saved her career, but they had executed a savage, bloodless betrayal that completely shredded her pride. The Ice Princess was not royalty. She was a highly managed, beautifully dressed corporate asset, forever trapped behind a flawless, suffocating mask.